Okay, so yesterday we were talking about multicellularity, okay, and we talked about how it was a really important evolutionary kind of product, okay, because it allowed organisms to overcome the surface area to volume ratio problem that was faced by large single-celled organisms. Okay? If a single-celled organism gets too big, diffusion doesn't work over long distances very well, and the cell will begin to suffer. So they naturally divide to be smaller. Okay? That's what the whole cell size activity on Monday was all about, and that's the reason why multi-micro, okay, that one cube that had all the little cubes in it, okay, didn't have those problems. Its surface area to volume ratio was the same as a single cell, even though it was much bigger, and that's because it was made up of a whole bunch of single small cells. Okay? So becoming multicellular overcame that problem, and then of course if you can be bigger than everything else, that's a huge competitive advantage in the natural world, because less things can eat you, and you can eat more things. Okay? So that's generally good. Right? So that was kind of the big advantage of that. Now, we looked kind of at the end of the day in just kind of a rushed way, some of the examples of specialized cells in a plant, and we looked at the layers of the leaf, and I had to skip kind of a bunch of the cells that are also in a plant that are specialized, so I want to kind of go back to that. So the first group of cells that I want to look at in the plant are actually specialized by being unspecialized. Okay, I know that seems weird, okay, but they are what we call parenchyma cells. In an animal, they're called stem cells. These cells can become anything. Okay? That's kind of the beauty of stem cells, is that they are unspecialized. They are just a general cell, and when they receive a chemical signal, they essentially become a certain type of cell, whatever the plant in this case would need. Okay? And they will turn into a palisade cell, or they'll turn into a guard cell, or whatever. Okay? They'll become what the plant needs. It's not quite that simple, but it's essentially like that. Okay? So these are called parenchyma cells, and it was the discovery of these that actually led to the whole stem cell idea in humans. Okay? Stem cell research has come a long way in humans, but there are two kinds of stem cell research. Okay? There's pluripotent stem cells, and that's the kind of stem cells that you would have in your body right now. You actually have stem cells in your body right now. And there are embryonic stem cells. Okay? Where do you suppose we get embryonic stem cells from? It's kind of in the name. From an embryo, exactly. Okay? So embryonic stem cells are harvested from an embryo. So a fertilized egg that has been developing to a certain stage of development. Okay? They will harvest cells from that embryo, and they can, essentially we know what cells in an embryo are going to become what. Okay? So if we want to grow liver tissue, you harvest the cells that would become that embryo's liver, and you grow them, and you can grow liver tissue, which could then be grafted onto a person's liver that wasn't working right. Okay? Or you could grow pancreatic cells and graft them onto a person's pancreas who has diabetes, and they would no longer have diabetes. There's even some research into growing nerve cells that can be grafted across a broken spinal cord, okay? And allowing people to regain the use of their legs post-paralysis, okay? Things like that. So there's all kinds of research into that. The problem with embryonic stem cells is where you get them from. Canada and the US have both banned the research of embryonic stem cells. You want to think of why? It's actually not dangerous at all. The science is basically just culturing cells and growing them. So all you're doing is growing some liver tissue. Okay? It's not really like cloning or anything like that. It's just, okay, I know these cells were destined to become this embryo's liver, and if I grow them in a culture, I'll get a whole bunch of them. Right? So there's nothing really dangerous about it.
Is it seen as immoral?
It is, yeah. Especially from like a lot of Christian perspectives. it is viewed as immoral because an embryo is going to become a person. Okay? If I harvest the cells from the embryo that are going to become its liver, it will die. Okay? So essentially it's seen in at least Canada and the US as trading a life for a life, and that's not viewed as right. So right or wrong, that's what in North America at least is believed, and why embryonic stem cell research is not allowed. It is allowed in a lot of other countries and is showing a lot of promise. That said, pluripotent stem cells still are good. Okay? We can still use them to do a lot of things. Okay? In fact, they use them to regrow connective tissue like cartilage in arthritic joints. Okay? My surgeon was actually telling me about this. I just couldn't afford the procedure. But it basically involves doing a little liposuction, so it's like 2 for 1. Okay? They take a little bit of the fat out of your love handles, okay? They centrifuge it, and they get some of these pluripotent stem cells in there, and then they inject them into your knee or elbow or shoulder, whichever joint is needing it, and it can actually regrow the cartilage, okay, making you less arthritic. So there's lots of kind of really cool stuff about having unspecialized cells that can be given a chemical signal and become something else, okay? There's kind of a lot of use for that, and organisms do it naturally. Okay, we've just found ways to manipulate the process to make it more advantageous. All right, there are other kinds of cells in a plant that are specialized for conducting water and sugar. Okay, the plant needs to not only support its foliage, that would be all of its leaves, and keep them at a high level where the sun can strike them, okay, but it also needs to supply those leaves and that foliage with water. And it needs to take the sugar that's produced by that foliage and transport it to the parts of the plant that can't make it for themselves, namely the roots. So, in order to make essentially tubes that can transport water, you have to have cells with a unique shape so that they can create a tight seal and not allow water to leak out. Okay? So typically you see these cells that have kind of a tapered end to them, and they fit together in such a way that they create this tight seal. Okay? And being lengthwise like that also reinforces their strength and helps to increase the strength of the stem so that it's not only flexible but also strong enough that it won't break. Okay? All right, so the water conducting cells are part of the xylem, which is something we're going to talk about later on today. The xylem are the tubes that carry water up the plant. Can you transport stuff up the plant and down the plant in the same tubes? No. Okay? That would be like having a northbound train and a southbound train on the same track. Okay? It's not going to work very well. Okay? So there's actually separate sets of tubes in a plant that carry both of these things. Right? So there are also sugar conducting cells. Okay? They make up the tubes of the phloem. Okay? And they look different because they're carrying a fluid that is much more viscous. Okay? The water conducting cells are just carrying water. Okay? Water is not that viscous, so it's not too tough. But the sugar that's produced, okay, gets carried down the plant in the form of sap. Okay? You've probably all experienced getting sap on your fingers. It's super sticky and thick. Okay? So the cells, the tubes that carry this sap, have to be specially designed to keep it flowing, okay? Allow it to do that, and prevent any crystallization, because sap is full of sugar. Okay? And if it gets to a certain point, the sugars can start to crystallize out and become solid, and if that happens, they can block the tube. Right? So there's actually little plates in the phloem tube that actually act as a kind of a grate. And if any crystals form, they'll hit that grate, and the weight of the sap above will crush them, okay, and keep them from getting too big and blocking off the tube. Okay? So they're specialized for carrying thick, sugary sap. All right, then we talked about this, the layers of the leaf. And I'm just going to quickly go back to that because, as I said yesterday, I always ask a question on the unit exam about multicellularity, specialization, and I use the leaf as that example. Okay, so expect on your unit exam you're going to get a picture of the layers of the leaf like this and be asked, tell me how this organism is a true multicellular organism, okay, using what you know of multicellularity, okay, and you would say, well, there's specialization, and you would talk about all of the different parts, okay, of this leaf and how all these cells do a different job, okay, and how that's specialization, and et cetera, okay. So just a quick review here. If we're looking at the layers of the leaf, and actually we'll look at a different diagram on it because we looked at that diagram yesterday. Okay, still the same thing. We've got the upper epidermis. Okay, and on the upper epidermis, those cells are basically clear. They don't carry out any photosynthesis, or very little. Okay? Their job is to simply secrete that waxy cuticle. Okay, so they secrete the waxy material that you can feel on the leaf of a plant. Okay, and it coats and seals the leaf so that water cannot escape through the leaf, okay, or be absorbed by the leaf. Okay, so that's why dewdrops will run off of the leaf and land on the ground, where they'll be absorbed by the roots, which have specialized cells for absorbing water and nutrients. Okay. So beneath the upper epidermis is that palisade layer, the one that you're drawing or doing the lab diagram of for your lab report tomorrow. Okay, all of those cells are basically cylindrical or hexagonal, but they're long and skinny, okay? And they're packed in really tight. Their shape makes it possible to pack a lot of them into a small space because they're very uniform. All of those cells contain lots and lots of chloroplasts. Okay, and you can kind of see that in this diagram. All those little green dots there. Okay, every one of those is a chloroplast. There's not a lot of cells elsewhere in the leaf that are as densely packed with chloroplasts either. Okay, so their main job, carry out photosynthesis. That's why they're on the top of the plant, top of the leaf. Sorry. Okay, is because that's where the sun is going to be. Okay. In the layer below that, there are irregularly shaped plant cells, and there are cells that are designed to conduct water and sugar. Okay, so if you've ever looked at a leaf's surface is covered with veins. Okay, you can kind of see them kind of snaking all over the leaf. Okay, those veins are parts of the plant's vascular system. They carry water and sugar to the leaf, just like your veins carry blood from your body back to your heart. Okay, same idea. So on in the middle of the vein, okay, the vein contains both types of conducting tubes. It contains sugar conducting tubes, which are on the outside, and it contains water conducting tubes, which are on the inside. Okay, and there's a reason for that. Conducting water means you don't get a lot of nutrients. So the water conducting tubes are actually dead. Okay? They're cells that used to be cells that carry sugar. Because a plant grows from the outside. Okay? You ever notice that when you look at a tree that's been cut down, it has rings? And the rings tell us how old the tree is. Each ring represents where the outside of the tree was each year. Okay? It represents where the phloem was. The sugar conducting tubes that are alive are always on the very outside of the plant. Okay? So those rings mark where that layer was each and every year as the plant grew. So on the outside of the ring are the sugar conducting tubes, and inside the ring are the water conducting tubes. And that's also an advantage because water will naturally move from where there's lots of water and very little salt to where there's lots of sugars and salt, and that'll draw it out of the xylem that way. All right, the irregularly shaped cells that are in the layer here are called the spongy layer. Okay? And they have the gaps in between them that we talked about yesterday. In those gaps are carbon dioxide, water vapor usually, okay, and oxygen, and that's where all those gases are being exchanged. Okay? Carbon dioxide is going to go from this layer to the palisade layer where it's needed. Okay, by diffusion, because they're going to be using a lot of carbon dioxide to carry out photosynthesis. Okay, as they do that, oxygen is going to be produced, and it's going to go back to the spongy layer. Okay, water is going to be evaporating during this process. So what you've got is gases and materials that have to move back and forth within the layers of the leaf. Okay, some of those gases have to get in and out of the leaf okay, through something. They can't move through the cuticle because it's a tight seal. So on the bottom of the leaf are the stomates, and we talked a bit about these yesterday, but I didn't get a chance to really talk about them. Okay, the stomates are also made up of specialized cells, 2 of them, guard cells. Okay? And guard cells can change their shape to open and close the stomate. So what happens with the stomates is their job is to allow water to evaporate, oxygen to move out, and carbon dioxide to move in. When they're open, those gases move freely in and out. Okay? So when they're open, photosynthesis can occur. When they're closed, photosynthesis stops. Which is a smart and natural reaction to water loss. If you need water to carry out photosynthesis and you're running out of water, you best shut off the photosynthesis. Okay, so what the plant will do, not consciously, okay, but by osmosis, is close the stomates. Okay, now I almost always ask a question about the cuticle and the stomate, okay, on an exam. So how they both help the plant regulate its water. Okay, the cuticle just seals the leaf, doesn't let water in or out. The stomate is what controls the water getting in and out. Okay, so in the morning, after it's been cool through the night and the plant's roots have had a chance to replenish the water, okay, the spongy layer becomes inundated with water, becomes very full, and the concentration of salts is very low. That allows the water vacuoles in the 2 guard cells to fill. And when they're full, they push really hard against the cell wall. And they cause the cells to have kind of a bean shape. So each guard cell is kind of shaped like a bean when they're full. Throughout the day, as water evaporates, salts get left behind. Okay? If you've ever accidentally boiled off an entire pot of water, okay, you know that there's salt left behind because it burns onto the pan. If you haven't done that, don't. It stinks and it wrecks the pan. Okay? But the salts get left behind. So as those salts get left behind, it creates what transport process? I actually said it twice already. What cellular transport process works about water and salt?
Osmosis.
Osmosis. Okay, so as salt builds up in the spongy layer, water gets drawn out of the guard cells by osmosis. They can't stop that process. It just happens. Okay? And as that happens, they lose their ability to maintain the bean shape of the guard cell. And they become more rectangular, which closes the stomate. Okay? So it's just a natural reaction to water loss that prevents more water loss. The stomate's closed. Now, the upside, the more water gets lost. The downside, the more photosynthesis happens. Okay, so the plant's got to it doesn't make a choice, but like we personify a little bit. It makes a choice, okay, between conserving water and carrying out photosynthesis. All right, I would like you guys to write down some answers to those questions. I'll give you a few minutes, and then we'll go through them together. And then we're going to move on to plant anatomy. Okay, so question number 1, why was multicellularity so superior to being single-celled or unicellularity? Okay, what competitive advantage did it serve? We talked about that right at the beginning of class today. Why is it a big advantage? What did it allow organisms to overcome?
You could get bigger.
You could get bigger. Okay? You didn't have to worry about having a large volume and a small surface area being a big single-celled organism. You could be a big multicellular organism with lots of little cells with good surface area and volume ratios. Okay, number 2, how are the cells of the leaf different from cells found in the stem of a plant? Okay, what do cells in the leaf primarily have to do? Photosynthesis. What do the cells in the stem have to do? Transport water and support the leafy parts of the plant. Are they going to have different structures because of different jobs? Yeah, that's specialization. Okay? They're going to look a lot different because they have different jobs. Cells in a stem typically don't do a lot of photosynthesis. They'll do some because they have chloroplasts, but probably not enough to sustain themselves. Okay? They're still going to depend on what's going on in the leaf. Plus, they've got to be strong enough that they can support the weight of all the foliage, all the leafy parts of the plant above them. Okay? And they have to be able to obviously transport materials to and from that foliage. Okay, number 3, describe how the epidermis and the stomates have similar jobs. What are they both concerned with? You said it. Water, yeah. Okay, they're both concerned with water. The cuticle seals the leaf completely and prevents evaporation from the entire surface. Without that, it would dry out very quickly, like a moss. Okay, if you've ever seen what happens to a moss, if it gets in the sun, it turns crunchy almost right away because a moss doesn't have a waxy cuticle. So the stomates also do that. They are also worried about water, but they actually control the amount of water loss by that osmotic reaction of the guard cells. Okay, and describing how the stomate works, as the day goes by and salt builds up in the spongy layer, osmosis pulls water out of the guard cells, whose shape changes and closes the stomate. Okay, it is very important that you are able to explain that process for the unit again. All right, any questions on those 4? Then we are going to look at multicellular organisms, specifically transport in plants, because on Friday we are going to set up a lab that will run over the weekend about transport in plants. It'll be very similar to one you probably did in like the 5th grade, okay, where you had like a piece of celery in some food coloring, and you watch the food coloring go into the celery. If you didn't do that, you haven't lived, okay, and you will get to do that, but not with celery, okay, with a real plant. Something like those, actually. Those are the ones that survived the massacre from semester 1, because we just cut the leaves off of them. Some of them don't make it. These are very tough plants. So they're going to have to go through it again, because they survived. There's no reward there. Okay. We need to understand how transport within cells is similar and involved in transport in a multicellular organism. That means diffusion, osmosis, active transport, those kinds of things can still be involved, but on a larger scale. Okay? Understand how nutrients, water, sugar, minerals, etc., are transported in vascular plants. Learn the structure of vascular plants. Kind of already know that. We're just going to review it. Okay? And learn what forces are involved in transport. Transporting water and sugar is probably the most important thing outside of photosynthesis that a plant has to do. And it expends no energy to do it. A tall, like giant sequoia, okay, that can be over 100 meters tall, uses no energy to transport water from its roots to its leaves. 100 meters against the force of gravity, and it expends no energy to do it. Okay? It just uses some simple cell transport properties to make it happen. Okay. All right, so the first thing we have to understand about plants, at least vascular plants, is that the resources they need are not in the same place. They are spatially separated. Okay. Sunlight, carbon dioxide are in the air. Water and nutrients are in the ground. Here's the problem. There's no sunlight in the ground. You probably knew that already. It's probably not a surprise. Okay? But there's no sunlight in the ground, and there's not at least a significant amount of carbon dioxide available, okay, for photosynthesis down there. Similarly, there's no water in the air. I mean, there's humidity, but that's not enough to sustain a plant. So, the plant has adapted by developing different parts. This was one of the most important adaptations that was necessary for plants to make the move from water to land. Okay? They had to develop a system of roots to acquire water and nutrients. They had to develop a system of shoots that would allow them to carry out photosynthesis. Okay? And then as they became more complex, they had to start competing with each other. Anyway, that's kind of hard to imagine, like there's no tree Olympics, but like they really do compete with each other for resources. If a plant gets taller than another plant, it can shade it out and kill it. Okay? Some plants actually actively poison the soil around them to keep other things from growing. In case you've never noticed, look under a giant spruce tree in somebody's yard. Okay? You ever see anything growing underneath? Like nothing grows under a big mature spruce tree. Okay? For a couple of reasons. It's dark. Okay? It's shading that area. But all of the ground is covered with needles. Okay? The needle litter, the ones that have fallen off of the tree. When they start to decompose, they release an acid that essentially makes the soil inhospitable to anything but the spruce tree. Right? That's how they can actively compete with each other.
Could other spruce trees grow in other spruce trees like poison?
Not a like sapling, like it would be very difficult for a small spruce tree sapling to endure that. So they generally don't, and that again reduces the competition. After a fire, those needles are burnt away, the soil becomes more neutral, and the seeds can germinate and they can grow from there. Okay, so the body of a vascular plant is differentiated into a subterranean root system that absorbs water and minerals, and an aerial shoot system of stems and leaves that make the food. There's a lot of different adaptations to that. Plants have come up with a lot of different strategies for surviving where they live. Some plants will have what's called a stolon. If you have strawberries or raspberries, they do this. Okay? They'll grow in one spot, and then you'll see them like put out this little tendril, and that tendril will start growing another plant somewhere else, like a little ways away, or if it's a raspberry plant, like a long way away. Like, anyone have raspberries at home? Okay? Like they'll start popping up in the middle of your lawn. Okay, like 20 feet from the rest of the raspberries. And it's not because you track the seeds over there. Okay? It's because they literally will crawl a stolon, okay, over onto somewhere else, and that will start growing a new plant there. Okay? But they're connected. Okay? So there's a whole new root system over here connected to this old plant. So there's actually like a pipeline between the two. If there's more water and resources in the second location, it can be transported back to the first plant. It's kind of a competitive advantage that way. Okay? Some plants will make a rhizome, which is going to have like different types of bacteria in it that help them to process nitrogen from the atmosphere and things like that. It can also store chemical energy in the form of starch. Okay? Lots of plants actually store energy in the form of starch. That would be carrots, parsnips, turnips, potatoes, beets, okay, things like that. They store energy in their roots in what's called a tuber. Okay, so a potato is a tuber. Okay, it represents an energy storage area. Right? That's why French fries are so high calorie. You're taking the plant's energy storage molecules, starch, and you're boiling them in animal storage molecules, fat. Okay? So like when we have excess energy, we store it as fat. When plants have excess energy, they store it as starch. You combine those two things and you get extra yummy calories, okay? Because you're combining both, all right? So a plant can actually use this energy storage to grow the following year. Has anyone ever planted potatoes? Okay, how do you plant potatoes? Just like Mark Watney, right? In The Martian. Right? He cut the potatoes, he put them in the poop, and then they grew. Okay, you don't have to do the poop part here on Earth because there'll already be bacteria in the soil. Okay, but all you have to do is cut the potato in half, put it in the ground, and it'll start to sprout. Have you ever left one in the pantry for too long? Yeah, they grow sprouts, these purple legs. They look like a giant spider. Okay, and they'll grow these purple shoots that have little tiny purple leaves on them. If those little leaves get into some light, they'll start growing. Okay, I once left some in my basement for like almost a year, and I forgot about them. And then I was like, "What is that smell?" And I went down there, and there's like these rotten, this puddle of like potato juice with this little tiny shriveled up potato. They used to be the size of my fist, okay, but it was now like the size of my thumbnail. And there was all this purple plant growth that had come off of it. It was just trying desperately to find some light somewhere to carry out photosynthesis. But it had grown a significant amount of shoots just from the energy stored in one potato. Okay, now it doesn't last forever. If they don't get to the light, they'll die, which is what happened to those ones. Okay, but if they do get to the light, they'll start carrying out photosynthesis, and that's what happened if you've ever watched The Martian. Okay, the little leaves started coming out of the ground. Once they can carry out photosynthesis, they don't need the energy stored in the potato anymore. Okay? So plants will do that. It helps them to recover after a period of dormancy. Okay, an onion is similar, except it doesn't typically store as starch. It typically stores as sugar, which is why onions are sweet and potatoes are bitter. Okay? Starches are bitter compared to sugars. Okay. Everybody all right with that idea? So we got roots. Roots gather all the water and nutrients. Okay. They also help to anchor the plant a little bit. The stem transports between the leaves and the roots, and the leaves obviously do all the photosynthesis. Okay, another important adaptation for terrestrial plants. Terrestrial means they live on land. We're not talking about any like aquatic plants, any seaweed or anything like that. Okay, they have something called lignin. Lignin is like mortar or cement. Okay, if you've ever seen somebody like lay bricks, right? Between the bricks there's always the gray mortar or cement that goes between the bricks to hold them together. You guys have any idea what I'm talking about? Okay, so if you lay bricks, okay, so you do this, right? You got like this brick, and then you got this brick, okay, and then you put another brick on top like this, okay? But before you put this brick on, okay, you're going to put gray mortar between the bricks. Now, you ever notice that inside of a brick there are holes? If you haven't noticed that, there's holes in the brick. Okay? The mortar will go down into the holes, and then when you put this brick down onto the top and squish it on there, the mortar goes up into the holes of that brick, and then it solidifies. Okay? It becomes cement, basically. That's why we call it cement. Cement means to put two things together. Okay? So it hardens, and now those bricks are stronger than they would have been by themselves. Okay? They're now cemented together as one unit. Lignin works like that, except for plant cells. It's basically mortar or cement for plant cells. So if I turn this on its side, well, that didn't work quite like I envisioned it, but okay. Yeah, didn't work very well. Anyway, if I have a plant and its plant cells are growing upwards, lignin acts like a cement that hardens them together. What part of a plant is hard? The stem, especially if it's a woody plant, like a big tree. Okay? Not all plants, like these plants here at the front of the room, they don't produce very much lignin at all. They have green stems. But if something produces a lot of lignin, lignin is what makes wood. Okay? It makes the plant, the trunk of the tree, the branches much, much stronger than they would be if they were just being supported by water vacuoles and cell walls. A plant can't get very big using just water vacuoles and cell walls. Case in point, those plants. They're not going to get very tall. Okay? They might get 10 inches tall, maybe like that, but then they're not strong enough to support themselves after that. Okay? But if you've got something that can make that wood-like material, obviously it can grow a lot taller. Okay? Giant sequoia, like we said, can be over 100 meters tall. That's a lot of weight to support. Okay? The benefit of lignin is not only is it hard and can support all that weight, it's also flexible. Okay? So a tree can sway a little bit. Okay? All right. Questions on what lignin is? There's other places where plants will use lignin. Okay? Coniferous plants like spruce and pine use it to make their cones. Some plants, if they make nuts, will use it to make the shell of the nut. Okay? And some desert plants will actually encase a lot of the plant in it because it also prevents evaporative water loss. Okay, turgor pressure. We talked about this as well. We talked about how a plant will wilt if the water vacuole is empty. So these are plants I had in my room pre-COVID. When COVID happened, I was told I couldn't have plants in my room anymore. because apparently they're hard to keep clean and can harvest germs. I don't know. I just do what I'm told. I'm a rule follower. I have to kill them all. Okay? Because I couldn't take them home. So, these plants, okay, obviously both in need of water. Because I took this picture August like 24th, where I'd not been in school for 2 months and no one had watered my plants during the hottest, brightest part of the year. So they suffered terribly, okay, for a couple of months, and they looked like this, okay? And then I watered them, and they came back. Remember I showed you that video a while back of the plant kind of recovering from the water loss? Okay, that was this plant. Or that plant. It was one of those two plants. Anyway, okay? So as the water vacuoles fill back up, okay, the plant can kind of come back a little bit. So in a normal condition, the water vacuoles are very full, like you would see here, okay? And there's usually more than one water vacuole. A cell diagram usually only has one, but there's usually more than one, okay? And they push against the cell wall, and the plant stands nice and upright, okay? As water is lost, salts begin to build up. Osmosis starts pulling water out of the water vacuoles, and the plant begins to wilt. Okay? Those water vacuoles start to shrink. They don't push on the cell walls nearly as hard. Okay? And when the plant becomes very stressed, the cell membrane can actually start to pull away from the cell wall. It actually almost sucks the cell wall in, almost caves the plant in. Okay? And it wilts over like this. Plant can recover. You water it again. As long as it's not crunchy, you can usually get it back. Okay. All right, so turgor pressure, okay, that's pretty important. It's pressure of water in vacuoles, okay, and it helps hold up the plants that don't have the lignified walls. All right, this is hopefully a review for everybody, but okay. The job of the roots is to anchor the plant in the soil, absorb minerals and water, and conduct some water and nutrients, obviously, from the ground to the stem. There's two different kinds of root systems. Okay? There's a tap root, and there's a fibrous root. Okay? This one here is a tap root. Okay? Single root goes really deep. Dandelions have a tap root. Have you ever pulled a dandelion, okay, and it didn't like just break off, and you get this thing that looks like a really skinny white carrot, okay, it comes out of it, right? They get really, really long tap roots, okay? And then there's fibrous roots, okay? Grasses tend to have fibrous roots. That's why they're really good at preventing soil erosion. They can hold on to a lot of soil. A carrot is an example of a tap root. So some tap roots are actually modified to store starch, store energy. Okay? A carrot is one of those examples. So this would be a fibrous root system. Okay? Each one has its advantages and disadvantages. Okay? The advantages of the advantages of a tap root are obviously depth. Okay? If you can get a root that goes really deep, if the top of the soil dries out, you still get access to some water. And they can store energy. Fibrous roots have the advantage of they can spread out a long way. A tap root is just right underneath the plant, but a fibrous root system can go a long way from the plant. Which one do you think a saguaro cactus would have? That's one of the ones you'd see in Arizona, you know, they have the arms, like on the taco time sign. Which type do you think it would have? Yeah. Most people say taproot because they go desert, dry, deep. Okay? But it's actually counterintuitive. A desert soil is dry all the way down. Okay? Having a deep root doesn't really help you unless it gets so deep that it can tap an aquifer, that is like get into somebody's well. And some do. Okay? But the saguaro cactus actually has a fibrous root system, and it can run up to 50 meters in any direction from the cactus. Okay? Now, why is that an advantage? When it does rain, that's a lot of surface area that you can absorb water from because it doesn't rain very often. Okay? When it does rain, that can suck up a lot of moisture really, really quickly. Okay? Which would be better at anchoring you in the wind? fibrous roots are gonna be better. Okay, I know we think taproot because it's really deep, right? But the thing with a taproot is if the top of the plant starts to sway, it acts like a pivot point, and it'll wiggle like this until it either breaks off or comes right out. Okay? With a fibrous root system, it's like grabbing onto a whole bunch of different places, okay, where you can hold on more tightly. Something with a fibrous root is more likely to be uprooted than to break off. Okay, something with a taproot is more likely to break off than to be uprooted. All right. Questions on the roots? Everybody's good with those? Okay. Stems. So main purpose of the stems, they actually have a lot of things other than support and transport, but that's obviously their primary function. Support the plant, support the foliage, and essentially act as a connector between the roots and the leaves. You got to transport water from the roots to the leaves, you got to transport sugar from the leaves to the roots, and they have the two separate tubes for doing that. It's also where new growth is generally going to come from. So on any stem, you'll see buds. Okay? Buds are where those parenchyma cells, the stem cells, are going to be located. Because in a bud, there's the potential for new growth. That new growth could be a new leaf, a new branch, okay, whatever the plant needs. So in this bud are stem cells. If the plant needs to do something, those stem cells can become whatever it needs and grow. This is really important for plants because they're generally food for other organisms. So if something comes along and eats the top of the plant, kind of like what happened here, okay? So this is the same plant before and after, okay? They just cut this off right here. Okay? Well, now those little axillary buds actually grow into new branches and leaves. Anyone have ever been to like a hedge maze or have a hedge near their house? Okay, how many people have seen a hedge before? Okay, so it's a wall made out of like plant. Okay, those start out, believe it or not, as little sticks. Okay, a full-on hedge that can be a wall starts out as a bunch of small plants that are basically just one stick. Okay, all you do is you let it grow, and when it gets to a certain height, you prune it, and you make it grow from further back. Because if I cut it off here, it grows from further back, and it gets thicker. Every year, I cut a little bit back, and I make it grow from further back, and it keeps getting thicker and thicker and thicker until it's a wall. Okay? The same thing is true of your lawn. If you want your lawn to look thick, first off, you got to water it. Okay? But secondly, you got to cut it a lot. The more you cut it, the more it grows from further back, and the thicker it gets. Same is true for any plant. The more you trim it, the more thick it will become. If you've ever seen any of those topiary plants, the ones that look like someone has really taken a lot of time to shape them, they have. Okay? The way you shape a plant to look like a globe, or in some cases, like people prune them and they look like an animal or whatever, a dragon I've even seen. Okay? That involves like a whole bunch of pruning to make the plant grow from further back and get thick enough to do that. Okay? So stems are the site of a lot of new growth as well. Okay, and then the leaves. Oh look, it's the layers of the leaf again. It's like that's really important and a recurring theme that you'll see over and over and over again, okay, in this course. So leaves are the main photosynthetic organs of the plants. That is, they make the food. Okay, the rest of the plant depends on the leaves in order to get food. So green stems do perform some photosynthesis. Leaves have veins. We talked about those. In a vein are going to be the xylem and the phloem. Phloem on the outside, xylem on the inside, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay. Leaves vary extensively in form, but generally consist of a blade, a stalk, and a petiole. So if I'm looking at a typical leaf, it's not too bad. I don't draw well, so when I get something that looks like what I meant it to look like, I feel good about myself. Okay. So in a leaf, we're going to have, this is the blade. Okay, so if you imagine it's a shovel, that's the blade. Okay, this is the stalk. And where it would join a branch, okay, right here, okay, is the petiole. grasses don't have petioles because they don't have branches. The leaves grow right out of the roots. Okay? A blade of grass is a leaf. Okay, so this is probably the best diagram of the layers of the leaf that you have this diagram in your notes, right? I put this exact picture in there. Okay. So this is one of your best diagrams, or your best diagram. Your palisade layer, okay, very obviously all those cells are long and skinny and packed in very tightly. You've got your upper epidermis and the cuticle, okay? You've got below the palisade layer, you've got the spongy layer. Don't worry about mesophyll, we just say layer. Okay, and you can see all the gaps that would be filled with water, carbon dioxide, and oxygen. Then you've got your lower epidermis, and you've got your stomates, okay, made up of 2 guard cells, just like we talked about. Now, just as an aside, why are there only stomates on the bottom and not on the top? Actually, a couple of reasons. First off, the stomates are responsible for exchanging the gases that are present in the spongy layer, so you have to be close to the spongy layer. But secondly, the bottom of the leaf is always in the shade. You probably want the part of the leaf where evaporation occurs to be in the shade. Otherwise, it's going to have a lot more evaporation happening. Okay? It's not exposed to the sun, it's always shaded. And that, again, is another adaptation or survival tactic that plants use in order to prevent water loss. All the stomates are generally on the bottom. All right, so this is your typical leaf structure. Most plants look like this. This is a C3 leaf. Okay? This is a C4, or a cam leaf. They work a little differently because they're not a leaf. This is what a cactus would look like. Okay? You ever notice cacti don't have leaves? Okay? They actually do. That's what the thorns are. Okay? The thorns are leaves that have been modified over time and through evolution to be protective rather than photosynthetic. Okay? So the interior part, the fleshy part of a cactus, okay, is going to look like this on the inside. You're going to have these palisade cells, and you're going to have spongy cells, and they're wrapped around the veins. Okay? So that means there's less areas where water is just going to be able to evaporate. Okay? There's still going to be stomates, but the stomates look different. 4 guard cells instead of 2. Okay? So they're much more obviously concerned with evaporation and conserving water and all of that. Okay? And then you've got these spaces here that basically are just air. Okay? There's not going to be any water in there because that would represent too many places or opportunities for water to be lost. Okay. Make sense to everybody? Okay. So if you're dying of thirst in the desert, can you get water from a cactus? Yes. But people have the wrong idea about how that looks. Okay? They have this vision of if I stab the cactus, water will come out of it. Okay? It's so not like that. Okay? The consistency of a cactus, the fleshy part, is similar to like a melon fruit, like a cantaloupe or a honeydew, kind of like that, except stiffer. Okay? So not quite as like soft as a honeydew or a cantaloupe. And they don't taste at all like a cantaloupe or a honeydew. They're bitter. Okay? Really bitter. Like they taste awful. Why? It's not even, it's not enough sugar. There's lots of sugar.
So things don't eat it.
Exactly, so things don't eat it. Okay? It's just evolved, it's natural selection. If you're good and sweet, people will eat you. Okay? Things will come along and eat you. It's why fruit evolved. Okay? The whole purpose of fruit is so that animals will eat the fruit. What's in the fruit? And seeds. Now, I've just eaten this fruit. I go over there and I poop out the fruit that I ate and the seeds, and now the seeds are in this nutrient-rich medium from which they can grow. Okay? That's how fruit works. Okay? It's designed to be appealing so animals will eat it. Okay, that'll free up the seeds. In fact, some seeds won't germinate unless they've had a layer eaten off the outside by the digestive enzymes of animals. So they actually have to be eaten for the seeds to grow. Okay, so there's all these kind of strange things that go on. Okay, with things that have evolved over time to serve a purpose. Okay. Now, transport in plants. You also have this diagram. Okay, and I showed you this diagram, I think, before when we talked about the polar nature of water. Okay, so this is an electron microscope picture of the woody part of a tree. What do you see? Lots and lots of little what? Holes. Each one of those holes is a tube that runs the length of the tree, all the way to the roots from the leaves. Okay? Those little tubes are what carry the water. They're not big tubes. It's not like a big Slurpee straw. Okay? That wouldn't work very well. Okay? These tubes are microscopic. Remember, this, just for reference, that line I just drew is 100 micrometers. Okay? That line I drew is 1/3 or 1/4 the size of the amoeba you looked at. Okay? So all of those little tubes are way, way smaller than the cells you looked at, okay, under the microscope. They have to be, because they're going to use the polar nature of water to lift water. And water's heavy. So if I have a really big tube, like a pipe, okay, and I'm trying to move water up that pipe, the only places where water can do its whole polar nature of water thing are around the outer edges. It can create a hydrogen bond with the inside of the pipe, and those water molecules there can bond to the pipe by adhesion. The rest of the water molecules have to hold on to each other by cohesion. Is that a lot of weight? How strong are hydrogen bonds? Not very strong, so it's not enough. And you can't support this column of water that's really heavy, okay, by the polar nature of water alone. But if the tubes are really small, it's very, very easy, okay? And the polar nature of water can work if the tubes are small. And they're numerous as well. So I get just about as much space or volume of water here as I would with one single big pipe, except that it can use the polar nature of water to move it. Okay, so what goes on, and you've got the steps on the next slide here, so what I'm going to do is kind of go through those steps on the diagram. Okay, so we'll start with step 1. Water is absorbed by the roots. This is an osmotic pulling action, okay, that results in water coming into the plant. Okay, once the water gets into the roots, it's drawn up through the xylem. Okay, so that's step 3. Okay, is that the water is drawn up through the xylem. Now, the thing that draws it up through the xylem is actually this process right here. When water evaporates through the stomates, any salts that were in that water are left behind in the spongy layer of the leaf. Okay, so those salts are there. Now, what does water want to do to salt? Move toward it. It's osmosis. Okay, we talked about osmosis before. So if salts get left in the spongy layer, water will move towards the salts by osmosis. This creates a pulling force at the top of the tree. Okay, there's so much osmotic pressure that it will pull liters of water up the tree. Okay, just that salt being there, that osmotic force, the desire of water to balance salt concentrations, okay, will pull water up the height of a big tree, okay, to this point, and then it will evaporate. As it evaporates, that's part of the photosynthetic process. So carbon dioxide comes in, oxygen goes out, sugar is made as light hits it. Okay? That sugar then has to go down the tree in the phloem. Do we need anything special to make that happen? What'll take it down the tree for us for free? Gravity. Yeah. Okay, gravity will pull it down just fine. Okay, so the sugar will pull gravity down the tree. to the root. Or sorry, the gravity will pull sugar down the tree to the roots. Okay, and in the roots, cellular respiration occurs. Oxygen comes in, carbon dioxide goes out. Okay, they burn the sugar. All right, everybody okay with those processes? It's super important that you understand this osmotic pulling action. As water evaporates from the leaf, salt is left behind, water moves to it by osmosis, and then the part, sorry, I didn't talk about is, as water moves towards it, the water molecules are linked by their hydrogen bonds. So when one water molecule moves towards the salt, it pulls all the other water molecules up, just like that barrel of monkeys we talked about back in the chemistry unit. Okay, they're all bonded by hydrogen bonds, cohesion and adhesion, adhering to the inside of the xylem, cohering to each other, and pulling up the plant. All right, so that's all of those steps there. Make sure you know that really, really well. I always ask about that too. So when we look at a plant, okay, like we cut any plant off so we can see its stem, okay, especially if it's a big tree, this is what we're going to see. The xylem is in the middle, okay, the phloem is on the outside. Xylem is just old phloem, so it's basically dead phloem. Each year the tree grows, it expands outwards. It puts a new layer on the outside. That's how we get those rings. That new layer is part of the phloem. Okay. Now, let's say you're in Ontario or Quebec and you have a maple tree farm and you want to harvest the sap to make sugar or to make syrup, maple syrup. Which part of the tree do you want to harvest it from? The xylem or the phloem? What's in the xylem? Phloem. The phloem is what's transporting the sugar. Okay, the phloem's on the outside, the phloem is transporting sugar down. That's why the outside of a tree, if you nick it, sugary, sticky sap comes out. Okay, xylem sap, it's like water. Okay, if you hit the xylem, okay, of a plant, it's just water. It's not sticky at all. Right? So if you're a maple syrup producer, okay, if you've ever seen like they show them like hammering those taps into the tree, okay, those taps don't go in very far. You don't want to harvest the xylem. You go into the xylem, all that comes out of the tree is water. And it's drip by drip. It's not like turn off on the tap and you take a bath. Okay, it's like just drip, drip, drip. Same with the phloem. Okay, when you tap the phloem, the sugary sap comes out, but it's very slow. They hang a bucket on that thing and walk away. And they come back in a few days, and there's a little tiny bit of stuff in there. That's why true maple syrup is so expensive. Anyone ever like buy real maple syrup? Okay, not like Aunt Jemima. Okay, I mean that stuff's fake. Okay, it's not real maple syrup, and so it's really cheap. It's all like high fructose corn syrup. But real maple syrup is probably 4 or 5 times as expensive because of the harvesting and processing process. Okay, so phloem on the outside carries sugary sap down. Xylem on the inside carries watery sap up, okay, by osmosis and the polar nature of water. Phloem just has to use gravity. All right. So the xylem transports water up the plant. This is what I was talking about before. Okay, looking at this at like a molecular level, we can see that the water molecules will form hydrogen bonds with each other. That's cohesion. They'll form hydrogen bonds with the inside of the xylem. That's adhesion. Okay, and there's going to be an osmotic pulling force that's pulling from above. Okay, so transport is accomplished by a process that involves osmosis, adhesion, and cohesion of water molecules. Okay. Basically, this whole slide is important because it explains how the xylem works. Okay, so that stuff I've underlined, that's the stuff you've got to be able to explain to me. Biology is a lot of read, memorize, regurgitate. Okay. Okay, anybody need not anymore? Okay, remember, this is all in your notes package, right? All right, and then for the phloem obviously transports sugars that are synthesized in photosynthesis down the plant to the parts that don't carry out photosynthesis, and that is accomplished by gravity. So the phloem transports sugars by gravity. Right, so in the phloem, there are sieve plates, okay, little structures that are basically kind of the bottom cell wall kind of thing. Okay, and they're basically just a grate. If any sugar crystallizes out of the sap, that means become a solid, right? It'll hit those sieve grates, and the weight of the liquid sap from above will break the crystals up and keep them from blocking the tube. When phloems become xylem, basically the sieve plates are broken by then, and they disappear, and they don't get in the way of water moving up. All right, I would like you guys to write down some answers to those questions, and I think we'll have time to go through them as a class before it ends. Okay, so what processes are used in both intracellular transport and transport in multicellular organisms? Basically, two of the big three. Which two? That's where it happens. Which two cell transport processes? Osmosis and diffusion. Okay, those are our cell transport processes. We just finished talking about how osmosis is the force that brings water up the plant. Okay, so osmosis is really big, and diffusion is what allows water, carbon dioxide, and oxygen to move throughout the layers of the leaf from cell to cell. Okay, number two, we talked about this already. If you were tapping a maple tree to harvest sap for syrup, you would tap the phloem, because that's where the sugary sap is. No one's going to buy your maple syrup if you tap the xylem. Okay, because, well, I can put my pancake under the sink if I want that. Okay, that's pretty gross. Where is the phloem located, inside or outside? Outside. Okay, it's a very outside layer. Okay, number three, in the leaf, why are so many cells packed together near the surface of the leaf? What are they doing? Carrying out photosynthesis. Yeah, the palisade layer is carrying out photosynthesis. We want it packed together on the upper surface. Okay, and they are continually supplied with water by the xylem and the veins and organs. Okay, number four is kind of a diffusion question. Would a plant be able to transport water to its leaves more easily or less easily on a humid day? So if it's humid, what is there a lot of in the air? Water. Okay, so think about diffusion. Is it going to be easier or harder on a humid day for water to leave the leaf and go to the air where there's already lots of water? It's a little tougher, yeah. It's actually easier to make water move when the air is dry. Okay? Water will naturally go and evaporate quickly when the air surrounding it is dry. Okay. Number five, you have a plant that does not look very full, just a few stringy branches. What could you do to give it a more full appearance? Cut it. Yeah. Pruning will make it look more full, as long as you don't over prune it. Okay, like you can't go, oh, I just cut that sucker off. Okay, that's not going to work. All right, you're going to have nothing left. You have to leave some buds there for it to grow back. Okay. All right, questions on any of those? Okay. All right, tomorrow we're going to be learning more about plants and looking at the lab we're going to do on Friday.